So thank you very much, everybody. I appreciate your attendance. I want to introduce myself really quick. I am Bree Kruder. I am the Executive Vice President for ProLink Solutions. I'm very excited to have you with us for the next couple of days, and I will be the host for this session and sort of acting as MC throughout the next couple of days. Welcome to day one of ProLink Technology Live 2024. This is our traditional annual user conference, but we've rebranded it to make it more appealing for the industry. And this is now our fourth year hosting this event virtually. We've held sessions on industry topics, but for the primary focus of this conference is to offer training to our user group. The event is open to all public agencies. It's open to the public and all agencies nationally. And you will have the opportunity to casually interact with each other and your peers throughout the conference. Our audience today is both ProLink customers and non-customers. We've designed this conference to encourage participation. So except for this session, there will be poll questions asked throughout the conference during the sessions. We also have a concept built into Cvent, the platform that you're using to access this event, to host what we call Coffee and Bagel. Coffee and Bagel will be hosted during our breaks. It's about 15 minutes where you can join rooms and interact and have discussions with each other. And we will be randomly selecting winners throughout the conference over the next couple of days who participate with us and interact with us, just to encourage that collaboration and networking. So we'll be giving out some Starbucks gift cards based off of those who do participate with us in Coffee and Bagel. There's a short video on the conference main page at the bottom with the Starbucks logo gift card picture that explains how to participate in Coffee and Bagel. And each day we'll post that gift card winner on social media and use the hashtag ProLinkTechLive24 so you can keep up with that. This session you've joined now is titled the Keynote Washington Update. The speaker for this session is really me, just kicking things off before I hand it off to Jennifer Schwartz, the Director of Housing and Tax Advocacy for the National Council of State Housing Agencies, or NCSHA. Jennifer Schwartz leads NCSHA's legislative and advocacy activities related to housing tax programs, including low-income housing tax credit and tax-exempt housing bonds, and oversees other NCSHA housing policy priorities related to HUD programs and fair housing. I would like to now pass things off to Jennifer Schwartz to kick us off with our keynote. So thank you, Jennifer, so much for being here. We really appreciate it, and I will hand things off to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Bree, and Sam and everyone at ProLink for having me here today. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen if that's all right, so I can control my presentation. All right. So again, as I was saying, thank you so much to ProLink for having me here this morning. I'm Jennifer Schwartz. I'm the Director of Tax and Housing Advocacy with NCSHA, and it's always wonderful to see, to have so many of you here today, so many of my HFA members. Very glad to be able to give you a little bit of an update on what's going on in Washington. So why don't we go ahead and get started? Are you all seeing my second slide? Sorry, looks
Yep,
like
the national economic.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay, great. Great. So just to get started, I always like to paint the picture of what's going on out there before I dive into what's going on here in Washington, D.C. and the impacts on affordable housing and our legislative priorities. So starting off with mortgage rates, we are seeing the mortgage rates with the Fed dropping Fed rates down. Mortgage rates are coming down a little bit, which is definitely helping on the production side, although there's still a lot of other challenges going on. Clearly, one of the major challenges is that rents, while they've been moderating some, have had gone up so much that we are seeing an all-time cost burdened level for renters with emergency rental assistance programs, which I worked on with many of the state housing finance agencies having run out and no longer accepting applications. There are a few states that still have ERA programs that are running, but for the most part, that money has been gone through, and we're really at a very difficult point with such high cost burden rates for renters nationwide. At the same time, building materials costs have begun to moderate some, but I think we're still at a place where materials are expensive. Mortgage rates are higher, certainly, than they had been, even if not as high as they were in the most recent past. And a lot of challenges on the operations side with really high insurance costs. I know problems with unpaid arrears and a number of things that you all are facing and that your owners and property managers are facing. So here in DC, and not a surprise to anybody who is certainly in a swing state right now, but we have an election going on in a couple of weeks, and voting is already underway in a lot of states. But campaigning is at an all-time high as we're getting to the last couple of weeks of the campaign before Election Day in early November. Currently, we have divided government in DC, with the Senate controlled by the Democrats, the House controlled by the Republicans, and obviously President Biden in the White House right now. Those party control in both chambers is really at a very historically slim margins right now. We have the current makeup of Congress. In the Senate, we've got 51 Democrats and 49 Republicans, so very, very slim majority there. And on the House side, we currently have 220 Republicans to 212 Democrats with 3 vacancies. So every single vote that Congress is taking is really challenging because there's always going to be division within the parties. So that's been a real challenge to move anything forward. We're going to have a lame duck session after the election. That's what it's called after Congress comes back after an election, but before the next Congress takes office. Oftentimes, a lame duck provides an opportunity to move things if the leadership in both chambers decides they really want to clear the decks for the next Congress, make it so that the next Congress can get started without having to clear up work that was going on in the previous Congress. But it can be really difficult. And what happens in the lame duck is largely going to depend on the outcome of the elections and whether Congress feels that they are better off getting things done versus pushing it into the next election. The different parties are going to make decisions based off of how well they're going to be situated in the next election. But we will definitely have that lame duck. And we know that because the current appropriations bill, we have a continuing resolution that's funding all of the government on last year's funding levels through December 20th. And so Congress does need to do something before December 20th in order to keep the government active. So we're going to see them come back to office, really need to focus on appropriations before that December 20th deadline. They are either going to need to push that deadline back, either pass another continuing resolution that would go into next year, which a lot of members are not going to want to do. They're going to want to finish at least their appropriations activity this year. Or they could, if they can't come to an agreement, the government would shut down at that point. So that's where things stand on appropriations. The other thing I would say is that there's going to be a lot of pressure on Congress to pass something having to do with disaster relief during the lame duck session. So we've seen 2 major hurricanes come through, a lot of damage that's been done. So there will be interest in moving disaster legislation. We don't know yet what that's going to look like, whether it might include housing provisions. But I do think that opens up an opportunity for us to push for some of the housing tax provisions that didn't end up passing earlier this year. And I'll go into that in a minute, but as well as, a possibility for us to press for disaster housing credits, which we've gotten in previous years. So a lot that could be happening in late November, early December. And then lastly, I would say that on the tax side specifically, there is a lot of division right now between Republicans and Democrats because of the tax bill that did not pass the Senate earlier this year. A lot of hurt feelings there, concerns, things that were not finished at that point. And that is important because as we move into next year, there's going to be a major push on tax legislation, what's being called the Super Bowl of taxes, as Congress looks to figure out what they're going to do as provisions from the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act from 2017 expire. So I want to just start with a little bit of background for some of you who might not have been following everything that happened earlier this year. There was a really important piece of tax legislation that ended up not passing in the Senate. It was a $78 billion package. And among the various things that were in that package included a couple of provisions that would have expanded the housing credit. So first of all, restoring the 12.5% increase on the 9% side of the credit that had expired at the end of 2021. That would have been put in place for 3 years, retrospectively for 2023, as well as for 2024 and 2025. That bill also would have lowered the bond financing test from 50% down to 30% for bonds that were issued prior to 2026. And so that was legislation that passed the House back in January. It passed the House by a huge margin, 357 to 70, which we thought at the time was really setting us up well for Senate consideration of that bill. However, unfortunately, the Senate was not able to come to an agreement on the bill. The legislation was initially negotiated, I should say, between the chairman of the Finance Committee, that's Chairman Ron Wyden from Oregon, a Democrat, and the chairman of the House Ways and Means Committee, Jason Smith from Missouri, a Republican. They had agreed on this. However, Senate Republicans had not agreed to the proposal, and that's really where we hit a wall with this. So after a lot of back and forth, there was a vote in the Senate back on August 1st, which failed. They needed a 3/5 voting majority to pass a procedural hurdle, which they weren't able to do. So that failed on a 48 to 44 vote in the Senate, which really set us back. We had you know, it was really incredible to be able to get our housing provisions into this bill. Again, this is a $78 billion bill, which may sound large, but in comparison to what we're going to be talking about for 2025 was actually pretty small. It was a huge lift to get housing into the legislation to begin with. And we had a lot of high hopes. However, I think that as we look at what might happen in the lame duck session, the reason this bill failed had nothing to do with housing. I should also say it really had to do with other issues that were in the bill that had nothing, totally outside of our wheelhouse. Which means that housing actually had really strong bipartisan support. And I think that should tax legislation move during the lame duck, which is possible, especially if Congress ends up considering disaster relief at all, I think we have a chance to get the provisions that had been in this bill into that, and possibly, if everything goes our way, disaster housing credit provisions as well. So next year, as I said, we're looking at really major tax legislation in 2025. The Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, which many of you may know as the Trump tax cuts, that was the 2017 bill that significantly lowered individual tax rates, lowered the corporate tax rate down to 21%. It had been at 35%, and made lots of other changes to the tax code. Much of that bill is going to be expiring at the end of 2025. And so Congress is looking at something that could really see huge tax increases for most Americans in 2025 if that bill if those provisions aren't extended. Now, I will say one piece of that that was permanent at the time was the corporate tax rate. So when they moved that down to 21%, that is not going to change unless Congress changes it. There's no automatic, you know, midnight and Cinderella at the ball, things go back to how they were, as they would with the individual rates and the standard deduction and a number of the other things that were changed in the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. The corporate rate would stay at 21% unless Congress acts actively to change that. So what will happen in with tax legislation next year is really dependent on a number of things. First of all, who's president? We don't know whether or not the Vice President Harris, is going to succeed her boss, or if we're going to have former President Trump coming back. We don't know who's going to be in control of Congress. It's going to be very, very close in either way. I think we're going to see margins that are probably pretty similar to the margins that we have in this Congress, but we might see some changes of party control. The question of how much to spend is going to be really very much on the table, regardless of what the outcome is of the election. So if Congress were to extend the provisions that are going to be expiring, the Congressional Budget Office has estimated that to cost about $4.6 trillion. So again, I want you to keep in mind the bill that couldn't pass this year was $78 billion. So we're talking about a much more significant cost to extending the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act provisions at $4.6 trillion. And even if the vice president becomes president next year, what she has said is that she would like to not have a tax increase for anyone who's making under $400,000. Just extending the tax cuts for those folks would probably cost about in the $2 trillion range. So if you do it for the entirety of the bill, that's about $4.6 trillion, and that doesn't even begin to consider other changes that Congress might want to make that would cost money beyond just extending those provisions. So that would include things like the housing provisions that we're pushing for, which weren't part of the 2017 bill, but we are hoping would be part of tax relief next year. It certainly doesn't include some of the other things that have been promised by either campaign. So, for example, former President Trump has a number of things that he would like to see in addition to just extensions of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. He has talked about things like further lowering the corporate tax rate down to 15%, to not taxing Social Security, not taxing tips. The vice president also has talked about not taxing tips. She also has a number of other tax proposals that would also cost money. So, this could be a very, very expensive bill depending on where things come out. And there are going to be people on both sides of the aisle that have real concerns about the cost of the legislation. So that's part of this. The other question, of course, is will Congress be able to use budget reconciliation in order to sidestep the Senate filibuster? And so for those of you who are like, what on earth is she talking about? What is this budget reconciliation? Essentially, that is a mechanism by which Congress could pass legislation without the filibuster. So the legislation would pass in the Senate with just a bare majority. In order to do that, Congress would first need to pass a budget resolution, which is no easy task. It essentially would only happen if one of the parties were to sweep both chambers. So if Republicans take control of both the House and the Senate, they would be able to pass a budget resolution. If Democrats were to do it, they would be able to pass a budget resolution. And if so, they would be able to get this special mechanism for getting through the Senate for future legislation. So that is a real possibility. If Congress ends up divided with one party controlling one house and the other controlling the other, that makes passing a budget resolution almost impossible. And if so, then the filibuster would be in place, and any tax legislation would need to be able to garner 60 votes in the Senate. So that will weigh heavily as to what ends up happening. And then, of course, what's the economy going to look like in 2025? There's so many things that impact the economy, and Congress is going to be watching that. But Congress, regardless, right now is trying to prepare for this, because this is going to be a huge part of what it does next year. And so right now, the House Ways and Means Republicans, who, of course, the Republicans are in control of the House, so they're in control of the House Ways and Means Committee, and really for the past 6 months or so, have been doing a lot of work trying to get ready. Should they maintain control over on the House side, how are they going to act? And so the chairman of the Ways and Means Committee, Chairman Smith, has put together a set of 10 tax teams. Essentially, each of these teams are made up of Republicans on the committee, and they're looking at what can Congress do? What do they want to be able to have as part of their agenda? What's going to be the Republican tax platform in the House to start off with? And so I think one of the things that's been really interesting about this, and I think helps with the optimism, is that one of those teams is a community development tax team. And so even though the major purpose of this is to extend the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, they are looking at things that are outside of the purview of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. So the community development team is looking at affordable housing specifically. That is the major focus for their work. And the fact that Chairman Smith established this team, I really think shows that he understands that affordable housing has to be part of this discussion moving forward. He sees the housing crisis and the impact that it's having nationwide, which has been in the news constantly. Members of Congress, whenever I go into offices, are saying, that this is one of the number one issues that they are hearing from their constituents when they're home campaigning. So I think we are really well positioned in that way. And the fact that the Ways and Means chairman, way back in May, when these tax teams were set up, has said we're going to be dealing with affordable housing as one of our major issues, really bodes well for us. The Republicans over on the Finance Committee in the Senate have also started to do some prep work. Theirs has not been quite as public facing as what's been going on over on the House side. The Ways and Means tax teams actually had even put forward an RFI, request for information from the public, where they were asking for comment letters. That those letters were all due last week, and so NCSHA submitted a letter for the Ways and Means tax team. But the Republicans over on the Finance Committee are also doing a lot of work on trying to get ready, and so we've been also sharing our priorities with them. And then the Democrats in both chambers have been also less public about what they're doing, although I think that their agenda is likely to look like the vice president's tax agenda that she's been putting out on the campaign trail. Certainly, affordable housing is a major priority for them as well, but they don't have the same sort of formal process, again, that the House Republicans have had. So, as I mentioned, NCSAJ put forward a letter last week that went to the House Ways and Means tax team, and it really outlined where we are, what we want to see happen in tax reform next year. So these are some of our major tax priorities. Many of these are components of either the Affordable Housing Credit Improvement Act, the Affordable Housing Bond Enhancement Act, or the Neighborhood Homes Investment Act. Those are three pieces of legislation that NCSHA has endorsed. But I'm just going to go through these for you and let you know a little bit more about what it is that we're thinking. So first of all, we felt that we really needed to go bold on supply. There is clearly a huge supply dearth, both on the renter side and on the homeownership side. And given the needs, we felt that it really merited a major ask. And our ask was to remove the cap on housing bonds for 5 years. So as you all know, both multifamily bonds and mortgage revenue bonds fall under the private activity bond volume cap. And that for many states is a major constraint on what they're able to do. So about 2/3 of states right now are either cap constrained or they're at what we call parity, which means that the demand and the supply are roughly equal. However, what we've seen in recent years is more and more states becoming cap constrained. And this has been a huge challenge for them as their housing demand has really been more than what they've been able to fund. So we would suggest that Congress take housing bonds out of the cap for 5 years, which would give states a huge ability to make a major. I'm going to mute myself for just a second. Next is raising the housing credit cap by 50%. This is part of the Affordable Housing Credit Improvement Act. This is something that we've been pushing for a very long time. This provision would both. I am so very sorry. All right.
We can't hear it, Jennifer. So
Okay.
yeah.
I'm so glad that you can't hear it. I can hear it. And it's and my husband's
sure it's
going to
still
get an earful
distracting,
from
but
me.
we're good.
My husband's going to get an earful from me when we're done. Anyway, raising the housing credit volume cap, essentially what we would be doing here is putting the 12.5% cap increase back into the baseline. And then on top of that, factoring in a 50% cap increase, which would be phased in over 2 years. The Affordable Housing Credit Improvement Act also would lower the bond financing threshold down to 25%. That would be another way of being able to do a lot more with our existing bond resources. And this was, as you'll remember, something that had made it into that failed bill earlier this year, although that bill would have only lowered it down to 30%. We're also supporting optimizing carry forward PAB authority for housing. So right now, when authority is carried forward, it needs to be designated for a particular use. Sometimes that particular use is outside of the housing world, and sometimes those uses don't end up moving forward. So, for example, states that are maybe they carry forward authority into something like a high-speed train or something like that, and then that ends up not moving forward. Well, right now you can't redesignate that authority for anything, and so after 3 years it ends up expiring. We've seen some states that are very, very bond cap constrained actually have bond authority expire because of this. So we've been pushing, and part of our bond enhancement bill would be to allow carry forward authority to be redesignated for affordable housing purposes. We would also provide greater flexibility for housing credit basis boost. Again, this is part of the Affordable Housing Credit Improvement Act. So things like a basis boost in rural areas, in Native American areas, a 50% basis boost for properties that finance housing that has units dedicated for extremely low income households, and also parity over on the 4% side. Right now on the 9% side, states can provide a state determined basis boost. We'd like to be able to see that over on the 4% side as well. Next, we're pushing Congress to close the qualified contract loophole, which, as many of you know, has resulted in the loss of about 115,000 units across the nation because of owners opting out of the program after 15 years through the qualified contract process. We have been pushing for quite a while to remove qualified contracts as an option for future properties, and for existing properties to modify the tax code so that the price on qualified contracts would be the fair market value for the property rather than the current system of determining the price, which often makes the prices on these properties for a qualified contract far higher than what the actual value is. Therefore, it's kind of like an automatic opt out of the program. We would like to facilitate more GSE investment in rural housing credit properties. And this is something that really hit a snag a couple of years ago. The GSEs, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, had been permitted prior, well, had re-entered the market in 2018. Fannie Mae has really done a lot of its investment through multi-investor housing credit funds, which are the kind that are most likely to get into rural areas. A question came up about the GSE's tax status, which for a while had been stymieing their ability to invest in these multifamily funds. So clarifying that the GSEs are not what's called a tax exempt controlled entity would be huge in allowing them to continue to invest in rural areas. So that's another thing we've been working on. And then modernizing both the mortgage revenue bond and mortgage credit certificates programs are a huge priority for us. And lastly, establishing a neighborhood homes credit. This is this would be a new program that would be modeled after the low income housing tax credit program, but instead for the production of single family housing. All right. So I do want to talk about some of NCSHA's other priorities that are outside of the tax world as well, because these are also things that are really highly important to the work that state housing finance agencies do. So first of all, starting with the home program, we've been pushing for some time for reauthorization of the home program so that we can make some changes to that program to make it work better. Home has not been authorized since 1994. So it's really been in a pretty stagnant state for a long time. The home statute is a pretty prescriptive statute when it in comparison to other programs, which means that changes on the regulatory side have fewer there are fewer things that can be done there than in some programs, and we really need a number of statutory changes to home. So we have legislation that we've been supporting that has been introduced in both chambers. Unfortunately, at the moment, it only has Democratic support, but that would make a number of major changes to the home program. We're also very focused on appropriations, so increasing funding for home, and ensuring enough funding for rental assistance are top priorities of ours over on the spending front. And then lastly, this has been part of appropriations bills. There's been language in those bills that we've been pushing that would protect the state by state administration of the project-based rental assistance program under the performance-based contract administration program. So this is just a chart on appropriations and where things stand right now. As I mentioned earlier in the hour, we're currently under a continuing resolution, which is funding the government based off of last year's funding amounts. So what you see in the column that's titled FY 2024 enacted omnibus, those are the numbers that are currently out there for HUD programs through December 20th. However, we are expecting Congress to do something on appropriations. The question is going to be what comes out of those negotiations. And so the House and the Senate are at very different places in regards to some of the programs that are really key to us, particularly the home program. So as you can see, the administration asked for even funding, level funding for the home program at $1.25 billion. The House would reduce that all the way down to $500 million, which is a very small amount of money, especially considering the fact that home is distributed across, not just the 50 states, but hundreds and hundreds of local entities that are home participating jurisdictions. The Senate has a much higher number, 1.425 billion for home. So we've certainly been pushing for the Senate number there as well. But either way, regardless of what happens, even at 1.425, we still need more home funding, certainly, to meet the need. And then you can see the other numbers here. So the Senate bill in general is much more friendly to affordable housing than the House legislation that had been passed by the House committee. Either way, what we're going to see is negotiations behind the scene and something come out in the final legislation. It'll be really interesting to see how it ends up passing in December. The Speaker of the House has said that he does not want what's called an omnibus bill, which is when Congress pulls together all of the appropriations bills into one large bill and passes it instead of passing 12 separate pieces of legislation. He's also said that he doesn't even want a minibus, which is when you have a couple of those bills that are packaged together. He wants to actually see all 12 bills pass individually. Now, whether that happens, I think is still a really big question. It can be very difficult to pass these bills individually. So lots to be seen in the month of December there. But of course, before we get there, the main thing that is on everybody's list is the election. And I wanted to take a moment to talk a little bit about the different potential outcomes here and what we might see going into next year. So first of all, you'll see some question marks, and that's on the Senate. That's because if the Senate is controlled by Republicans, we do not know who the majority leader is going to be yet. The current majority leader, Mitch McConnell, is leaving that office. He has not announced at this point retirement from the Senate. His term still has 2 more years, but he is going to be stepping down as majority leader. There are currently 3 members who are running for or will be running for election to that position. John Thune from South Dakota, John Cornyn from Texas, and Rick Scott from Florida have all put their hat into the ring for Senate Majority Leader or leader of the Republicans, regardless of whether or not that's a majority leader or a minority leader. We don't know what's going to happen there. In the House right now, unless he ends up losing his speaker seat, we would have the current Speaker of the House from Louisiana there. That is, we don't know whether or not he's going to be challenged for that position. Or whether or not the House is going to remain in Republican hands. And then, of course, over on the Senate side, we would expect on the Democratic side, Senator Schumer would remain the leader for the Democrats, and Congressman Jeffries would remain minority leader for the Democrats over on the House side. But the big question is what's going to happen with these election results. And so the chance of a Republican sweep, I've seen anywhere from, a 30% chance to a 40% chance that Republicans could take all 3, both chambers in Congress, as well as take the presidency. It's probably a 15 to 20% chance that the Democrats could sweep and take both chambers as well as the presidency. As I had mentioned, things are going to be very, very different in either situation if there's a sweep, because they're going to move on budget reconciliation should that happen. But divided government is probably the most likely scenario. If I were betting my money on it, I would say that both chambers are going to flip, that the Senate would go to the Republicans, the House would go to the Democrats. And, I think the presidency is very, very much up in the air, but really anything could happen here. And so when it comes to affordable housing, I think, on the appropriation side, we would see a lot more push towards spending if the Democrats do a sweep, but probably not as much as what you've seen sometimes in the past. And that's just because the deficit is really looming large for everyone, both Republicans and Democrats. If Republicans sweep, we're going to see much more limited spending on affordable housing appropriations programs, on HUD programs, on USDA programs. But tax, I think, is a really different animal. While we might see something that's more generous on affordable housing should Democrats end up sweeping, the Republicans are very supportive of a lot of the things that we do over on the tax side. And so I think that we're really well positioned regardless of what happens. I think the biggest issue is if neither party sweeps the election and we end up with divided government, getting to an agreement is always going to be the biggest challenge. And housing is usually one of the things that helps glue things together because we do have really strong bipartisan support. But as we've seen with what happened this year on the legislation, the $78 billion legislation that ended up falling apart, other things can easily derail that. Now, there is going to be a real lot of pressure to get to some sort of an agreement, because if they don't do anything, there's going to be major tax increases across the board for Americans when those provisions from the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act expire. So that's a real concern. But getting to an agreement is going to be hugely challenging. And it's very possible that that doesn't happen until sometime in 2026, in which case they could make some of these changes retroactive to 2025. So you're going to see a lot of discussion next year on taxes, regardless of what happens. But much faster action if we have a sweep from either party, and probably a much slower process if we end up with divided government. So, a lot of this just remains to be seen. The other thing that's kind of another specter over everything that Congress does is what's going to happen with the debt limit. So if you all will remember, Congress and the president came to an agreement on the debt limit back in June of last year, in which they essentially suspended the debt limit until January of 2025. So in January, the debt limit comes back, and immediately Treasury is going to have to start what's called extraordinary measures to ensure that we're able to continue to pay all of our bills. We do not know at this point how long they're going to be able to have extraordinary measures, but Congress is going to have to deal with how to handle the debt limit at that point so that we don't default on our debt. And so that means, are they going to, suspend the debt limit for a longer period of time? Are they going to put a debt limit back in place, but increase how much it can be so that it buys us some more time? We just don't know what's going to happen with that. But that is going to be kind of front and center in January as soon as they get back. And if we end up with divided government of any sort, we are going to need to they're going to need to figure out how to handle that pretty quickly in a very challenging situation where people really don't agree with each other. So you're going to see a massive game of chicken if that's the case. That's what I have on the legislative side. I do want to talk for a few minutes about regulatory changes that we're seeing. So first of all, there is a proposed rule that's out there for the home program. As I mentioned before, the home statute is very prescriptive, so it can be difficult to make changes. However, HUD did a very major review of the home program over the last couple of years, and last early summer, late spring, came out with a proposed rule on home that makes a lot of changes that I think are really positive, albeit not as much as we would like to be able to see changed about the program because there's so much that would need statutory changes. So some of the things that are in this proposed rule that we're waiting for it to be finalized include aligning home rental requirements with the housing credit and other HUD programs, some higher rent limits specifically for households that have vouchers. Right now, high home rents are only based off of the unit, not if the voucher payment standard is higher than that. The owner can't take that higher payment standard like you could with the housing credit program. This would align that, allowing you to use PHA utility allowances, making some modifications to the CHOTA requirements, which would be a massive change to really help make it easier for entities to become CHOTAs. Some new tenant protection requirements and increasing the per unit home maximum subsidy limit. These are all changes that are in that proposed rule. We don't know when they're going to be able to finalize it. I'm not expecting it until into next year. And so a lot of this is also probably could get put on hold, especially if we see a change in party of the administration. We don't know when or if that final rule will come out. If the vice president ends up winning the election, then I think that things will probably continue to move as they have been in regards to this regulatory change on home. Other notable regulations, of course, that you guys are going to be talking about, I'm sure, during the rest of the ProLink Technology Live. HOTMA implementation, Inspire implementation, the Build America, Buy America Act is another major thing that we're looking at that could have very big implications for cost and timelines for projects. Just so that you know, most many PJs got their home and housing trust fund obligations from HUD after August 23rd for 2024 money, which means that BABA is going to apply to those grants, as opposed to those that had their grants from HUD prior to that August 23rd date. We're still waiting to see really what that's going to look like in practice, and I think is certainly concerning. CRA, the CRA Act for banks, is also having a major issue. Oop, I see you moving my slides up there. We are waiting to see what's going to happen with a lawsuit against the new CRA rule, so that's still in process. There's also an affirmatively furthering fair housing rule, which was introduced as a proposed rule, gosh, over about 2 years ago now. And that it was one of the first things out of the gate when the Biden administration took over, but has been sitting there without being finalized for quite a while. And then lastly, I would say that there was a joint statement back in September from the secretaries of HUD, Treasury, VA, USDA, and a number of other offices about the housing protections under the Violence Against Women Act, basically saying that all of the confirming that VAWA applies to all of these different housing programs, which includes the low income housing tax credit, and saying that each of those agencies is responsible for providing guidance on how housing protections under VAWA apply to its programs. So, lastly, before I open it up to questions, I wanted to just note that NCSHA issued a couple months ago now model compliance forms for the housing credit program. This includes an updated TIC that and an updated asset self-certification document, both of which comply with the changes under HOTMA. And so I know a lot of states are in the process of implementing those. But we also have a number of other changes that we made to all of our forms, things that are in keeping with our updated recommended practices that were put out at the end of 2023, and other changes. And with that, I'm going to open it up for questions for our last 8 minutes. And Bree, I don't know if there are any questions that came in or if there's anything that you wanted to ask me.
There are a couple questions that came in, so we can get started. Please feel free to use the chat feature in Cvent if you have any questions. This is our time, people, so go ahead and submit those, and then I will see them posted to me on my phone here. So the couple that have come in so far. Okay, first one, removing the bond cap seems very ambitious. Is this more likely to happen if we have a Democratic sweep?
I think it is more likely if there's a Democratic sweep. I will say that there are other private activity bonds that are not subject to the cap. And so what we've been saying is that Congress should be prioritizing housing the same way it does with 501c3 bonds or some of the other things that are outside of the cap. It's probably a big lift, and it's possible that they will consider, an increase to the cap rather than taking housing out of the cap. But we wanted to put that forward really as a, really to say, if you want to really do something big that's going to increase the supply of affordable housing, this is what you can do. Now, whether or not it happens is, certainly, in our constrained reality, maybe not likely to be, for them to do exactly what we've said. But I think we really wanted to put that out there as a solution to the housing crisis for Congress to consider.
Okay. The next question that came in, any examples of how HUD is proposing to align home with housing credit programs?
So, one of the major things would be to allow those high home rent units to get the higher voucher payment standard where currently they can't. So, with the housing credit, you can accept that. With a lot of other HUD programs, you can accept that. But they were looking at a couple of other things as well. I'd have to go back and reread through the proposed rule. But HUD actually, and I'm going to I think stop sharing my screen if that's all right, since you've got the questions seen up there. That way I can pull up, I had up here
Yeah, can
HUD's.
you guys see my screen, the questions, or just you, Jennifer? I'm confused. Can you
Um,
see?
I was seeing your screen all along. I hope you were,
Okay.
it sounded like you were seeing my screen though, which was good. Um,
Yes. Okay.
so I'm just going to put in the chat though. Oh, actually, is this go? I'm not sure if our chat goes to just us or to
It
everybody,
does
but
just go to us.
well, you can circulate this, but this is the fact sheet on everything that's in the home proposed rule so that you can share that with folks that HUD had put
Okay.
together.
Yeah, that'll
Yes,
be
I
in
just
your
shared
CVent
that.
chat, everybody. So just keep a lookout for that. Um, Next question. I thought the CRA reform was already done. What are other CRA changes that are being discussed now?
So the issue with the CRA reform is that there is a lawsuit that is preventing implementation. So we don't we don't know what's going to happen with that lawsuit right now. CRA is still under the old rules until that lawsuit is resolved.
Um, if the government is divided, what NCSHA priorities are you most optimistic about coming to fruition?
So I still think that we're pretty optimistic about a number of our tax priorities. I think, lifting the bond cap could be probably a step too far, but things like getting a cap increase, it might not be a full 50% cap increase for the housing credit program, lowering the bond financing threshold. These are things that we have really strong bipartisan support on. And I think in many ways actually make it easier for them to pass a bill by including those sorts of things that we can have both sides come together on. There's, we might not get the 50% test lowered all the way down to 25%. It's all going to depend on money, but I still feel pretty optimistic that Congress is going to be considering a tax bill and that housing will be part of that tax bill in some way, shape, or form. And the most likely thing is going to be changes on the housing credit side that would really provide an increase in resources. We are going to be working on some of the other provisions that are also in the Affordable Housing Credit Improvement Act that I didn't mention. There are a number of things in there that don't cost money that could move forward if Congress is divided. Counterintuitively, if Congress ends up being controlled by one party and they move things through reconciliation, the kinds of changes that don't cost money but make policy changes actually can't be moved that way. So you might think, oh, well, the easiest thing to move would be those things that don't cost any money, like changing the student rule, for example, which is something that we've been pushing for. That you can't do if Congress moves tax legislation through reconciliation, just because of the kind of arcane rules surrounding the reconciliation process. So in that case, you would see changes that have a cost associated with it and not those other programmatic changes that we'd like to see.
Interesting. Okay, I believe we have covered the questions that were submitted. So unless I get one in the next two seconds here, I think that we will close our Q&A. And Jennifer, thank you so very much for being here. We very much appreciate your attendance
Hey,
and willingness to support us for our keynote. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and walk through the next couple
Bree,
slides of
Bree, can you
our
hear me?
housekeeping.
To interrupt real quick, there is one
Sure.
question.
Oh, there is one more. Jennifer, do you mind answering the
Oh, yeah,
last
of
one?
course.
Okay,
Sure.
go
So,
ahead, Sam.
has NCSHA considered providing training and or guidance on the bond recycling program to help extend volume cap?
It's not something that we've done in the past, but I think that is a really good idea. We know there are, I think, 6 states that have bond recycling programs under the current system for bond recycling, which allows those proceeds to be used to fund more multifamily housing. There is a provision in the Affordable Housing Credit Improvement Act that would expand that some to allow those multifamily proceeds to be used for your single family program instead. And to make a number of other changes that would simplify the bond recycling process. I'd love to see something like that move forward as well, so that you could have more of the new bond cap that could be used for multifamily. But that is a really good idea, and I will take that back. I'd love to know from states that do not currently have a bond recycling program but are interested in starting one, who you are, so that we can see how much interest there is in that.
We can get back to you on that.
Great.
Okay, great. Well, thank you again, Jennifer. We'll follow up if there's any other questions. I do have Jennifer's email. I'm sure many of you also do, but we'll follow up and try to respond to those. And any feedback you have on Jennifer's keynote, we appreciate you submitting that to us. But thank you again for being here. We very much appreciate it. Thank you, everybody, for joining this session. I hope you found great value in it and what was covered today. It's definitely a unique year to be hosting ProLink Tech Live. I think it's our first election year to run with our ProLink Tech Live. So a little bit interesting Washington update this year. One more thing I wanted to share, just to get it in people's minds, for those of you who do attend the HFAI conference, NCSHA's HFAI conference, the Institute in Washington, we will be hosting a user group meeting lunch similar to what we did last year. So please stay tuned for more information on that. All right, enjoy the break, and we'll see you all in our next session. Thank you very much.